So if we look at a lifespan compared to the potential rate of evolution, let's see what you guys told me. I should have multiple answers. Nobody should have a blank screen, yet I only see 11 of you. Do not do your homework right now. Put that away and answer the question, please. This is a sentence related to an organism's lifespan to the potential rate of its species. Don't know. So, an organism won't evolve during its lifespan. That's a true sentence, right? I like this one. If an organism has a shorter lifespan, they evolve quicker. So why would that be true? So if I look at bacteria compared to animals, they have a very short lifespan and they reproduce really quick, so they get a lot of generations in a short period of time. Us, we take a long time to live, therefore we reproduce over a longer period, and we don't get as many generations to change and evolve. So our evolution takes a little bit longer. And so the whole idea of lifespan is kind of like a weird way to think about it. The longer your lifespan is as a species, usually the slower you would evolve. So today we're going to look at how Darwin's theory has been updated and modernized since his initial discovery. And we'll look at the scales, the micro and macroevolution scales of evolution and the different types of things happening within the big idea and theory. So discoveries since Darwin's time, especially in genetics, have added to this theory to explain the evolution of species. Now, some parts of Darwin's theory have been modified and new parts have been added, but mostly the theory still stands the way it did initially, and it's still supported. The first major advances beyond Darwin's ideas was the rediscovery in the 1900s of Mendel's laws of heredity. Remember, Mendel was working at about the same time, and these two generally would not have crossed paths. Now, by the 1940s, scientists began to weave Darwin's theory together with newer studies of fossils, anatomy, genetics, and more. And this unification, they renamed it. No longer was it evolution by the means of natural selection. Now it's called the modern synthesis of evolutionary theory, meaning it incorporates many other things than just natural selection. So biologists have learned that evolution can result from processes other than natural selection. We did talk about that yesterday and the day before, but natural selection is one of the main driving forces in evolution, but it's not the only one. So survival and reproduction can be limited by chance or by the way that genes work. And in the modern view, any or all of these forces may combine with natural selection, as described by Darwin, and this synthesis helps explain some of the patterns of evolution that were unexplained by natural selection alone. So there were a lot of outliers, like, what's the sloth doing here? That's not the most fit thing on the planet, right? But it's here. It just has to work. And so there's other issues that we need to look at and things that animals and organisms do to help drive evolution. So there are some questions still, but modern biologists have basic tentative answers to these following questions. The first one is, can an individual evolve? And you guys would all tell me no. We evolve as populations. We've talked about that already. And he did correctly infer that individuals do not evolve. They must respond to outside forces, but individuals do not pass on their responses as heritable traits. Rather, populations evolve when natural selection acts indirectly on the genes by choosing what is actually in the phenotype. Can an environment act on a recessive trait if there's a dominant trait present? No. So sometimes natural selection gets tricked a little bit. because sometimes genes slip through indirectly. And then the next thing is evolution survival of the fittest? And maybe the best answer to that is sometimes, or usually. The natural selection can act only on the hereditable variation that exists in a population. Chance variations do not always provide the best adaptation for a given time and place. So evolution does not always produce the fittest form, just those that fit well enough to leave offspring. So again, it doesn't have to be the best, it just has to work. And the last part, I'm going to ask you guys, can we predict evolution? Can we predict evolution? Many say no. Lock you out. So I would agree. You cannot predict what direction evolution will take. Let's ask this question. Can you predict the rate at which evolution occurs? Can you predict the speed of evolution? Well, the best answer there would be yes. Okay? We can predict the rate at which mutations occur. Therefore, I can actually predict the rate at which evolution will happen. But I don't get to choose, or I can't accurately guess how it will happen and what the new changes will be. Forgot to pass? Yeah. They come back to me sometimes. I found this hanging in the bathroom. So evolution sometimes results in larger, more complex forms of life, but this result cannot be predicted. Many forms of life are simple, yet successful, and mostly scientists cannot predict the exact path that evolution will take, though we can predict the speed that it occurs. And that's pretty useful. We're trying to think about the history of our Earth and the history of even our own species and how long we've been here and all that. So because of its effects, every aspect of biology, scientists can study evolution at many different scales. We list those as microevolution to macroevolution, with this thing called speciation happening between them, becoming a new species. So microevolution is going to be change in the genes of a population, small changes, whereas macroevolution refers to the appearance of new species over time, something new, a new species showing up. So I've had this discussion a lot with micro and macro. Usually people are like, well, I believe in microevolution but not macroevolution, and really they go hand in hand. You can't separate them from each other. Eventually small changes are going to accumulate into large changes, and you're going to end up with something completely different. It's inevitable. Yes, please hurry. So looking at micro first, starting from smallest to biggest, we look at the processes by which inherited traits change over time within a population. We understand this is a slow process. And there's 5 processes that feed into microevolution. We've talked about natural selection. Some new ones today are going to be migration, mate choice, mutation, and genetic drift. The first one, natural selection, you guys did a model over. You get that one, right? It can cause an increase or decrease in certain alleles in a population. We call those adaptations through natural selection. Start off with overpopulation. Variation exists within that. You end up with selection, and finally your adaptation, which is the predominant prevailing allele in that population. And then migration, the things we don't talk about when we look at natural selection, things moving into a new population. So if I move into a new neighborhood and I've got a new allele, I just introduced something to that whole population that wasn't there before. So I mixed up the gene pool, so to speak. So it's the movement of individuals into and out of or between populations. And migration can change the numbers and types of alleles within a population. So we did that as humans, didn't we? We start migrating a lot? Yeah. We used to have pretty isolated races of people throughout the planet. Now we're kind of mixing back together as we migrate back to different countries and forth, and we get that. So that leads into this other thing called mate choice. When I found Mrs. Mason, I didn't like close my eyes like this at fair state and go, you're it. I point up, so I don't point at anybody. That's weird, right? So, you go, oh, that's my new wife. I didn't do it like that, right? So, you go out, you observe your surroundings, and you choose your wife. I won't say mate. That's kind of gross. What? Scan the field. There you go. Is that what you call it? No? 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 Okay. Cruise or whatever. What's it? No one cruises anymore. That's a weird. Gas is too expensive for that, right? So if parents are paired up randomly in a population, that would be true variation. Let me ask you this. The fact that we choose our mates, does that make us stronger, thumbs up, or weaker as a species? What do you guys think? The fact that we choose our mates as human beings, does that make us stronger or weaker? It's really like a loaded question, isn't it? Start thinking about it a little too much. Like, oh, geez. Yeah. Lock you out here. Whoa, we're all over the board. Some say stronger, some say weaker, some are like, kind of somewhere in the middle. As much as I like the fact that I can choose my own wife, and it's not random, like imagine a big wheel, we just spin a wheel, or draw a number, and it's like the lottery. You get, this is your new partner. It does make us a little weaker overall, and the reason why is it decreases our variation, right? Think about the complete randomness that fish have by the way that they spawn compared to choosing a mate. So, yeah, they might be stronger temporarily, but in the long run, as a population, it's really making them a little weaker or less resilient to changes because they have less variety in their population. Did you guys get that? It's kind of a weird thing to think about. So if parents are paired up randomly in a population, a random assortment of traits will be passed on to the next generation. However, if parents are limited or selective in their choice of mates, a limited set of traits will be passed on. So it decreases your variation, which we know is less biodiverse, which we know is less resilient. I'm okay being less resilient. I still want to choose my wife. That would be a weird world, wouldn't it? Yeah. Worms are kind of like that, right? A worm, like an earthworm, if you put it into like human years, they'll run into another worm like once every 20 years. So, isn't that crazy? So like imagine only seeing another person every 20 years. From their lifespan to ours, that's about what it is. You meet another human, if you want to keep, having a worm population, that's your new wife or worm wife, whatever you call it. What an isolated existence, right, an earthworm? Well, they don't really hang out together generally unless there happens to be a lot of nutrients in one area. So for them to bump into each other is, what? Yeah, right, lonely. Yeah, right? Yeah. And I'm talking about night crawlers at this point, not all worms. So mutations can change the numbers and types of alleles. That's also why they have both male and female reproductive organs, because they need to be able to reproduce when they run into another one. That ring around the earthworm's neck is actually an egg sac. So mutations can change the number and types of alleles from one generation to the next. However, such changes are rare. So the idea of getting a new allele sounds great, mutate and get something new, but it doesn't happen very often. Usually it causes the current gene to be dysfunctional and you have a disorder or something, okay? Or it doesn't cause any change at all. And then there's this new thing we haven't really talked about called genetic drift. And this is the random effects of everyday life. All those other things that we just can't put in these other categories that can cause differences in the survival and reproduction of individuals, kind of like the catch-all group. Because of these differences, some alleles may become more or less common in a population, especially in small populations. We see genetic drift the most evident on islands because they're small populations in isolated areas. That's why you get these really specialized niches on these different islands, like the Galapagos finches, and a lot of the different islands in Hawaii are like this too. So that's all microevolution. Now we need to get into the larger changes. Yes? Cancer is not usually genetic. So I'm talking about things that would have to be in your genes. Well, let me go back to what we're talking about. You're talking about genetic drift, okay? If a certain, like you're talking skin color like melanin, like a darker melanin would be better for a hotter climate, and as you move north, there's less melanin, obviously. Yes, that would fall into that category. Yeah, I see what you're asking now. I had to walk through the question to get it. You're fine. So to study macroevolution, we look at patterns which help form a new species. So we may study the direction, diversity, or speed of change, and patterns of change are seen when relationships between living and fossil species are modeled. So we look at what's here and what has been here in fossil record. Now, when we look at animals, we have to look at fossils because animals change slow. But I can look at bacteria in real time, and I can actually record different years' DNA sequences and how they do and don't interact now compared to they did a few months ago, even for some things. But when we look at animals, we've got to usually use a fossil record to do this. And so we're going to look at coevolution, which is a type of macroevolution where two species are living together and evolving together, where two organisms are part of one another's environment so they can affect one another's evolution. And species that live in close contact often have clear adaptations to one another's existence. So let's think about, we'll talk about coevolution between, let's say, an orchid and its pollinator or insect. I don't know if you know much about orchids. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of different types of orchids. And each orchid has usually one pollinator. And so the shape of the orchid will fit not just the shape of like that insect, but the weight of the insect too. There's one orchid, it's like a snapdragon, that if a bug falls on it, it won't fall down, it won't drop and open its pollen tube up. But if the right size insect, the right insect falls on it, it will drop just enough to allow it to sit or stand on it and then insert its its mouth part into its pollen tube and remove the nectar. And then if it's too big of one, it will fall on it and it will just knock it down and it will fall off. And so orchids are a good example of how some of them are actually perfectly shaped for the insect that comes in there. Another example of coevolution is mushrooms and trees. Mushrooms get a nice shaded area, a moist area from the trees and the canopy. And then when the leaves fall to the ground, the mushrooms return all of that nutrients back to the tree in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus. So they've co-evolved together. We're no different. We have organisms that we've co-evolved with that are living inside of us right now. One of them is E. coli in your lower gut. It helps you break down lactose. So you can't drink milk without it. So we actually house a colony of E. coli in your intestinal tract. And by the way, that's why poop smells like poop. It smells like E. coli is what it really smells like. So that's called coevolution. Got a little too much into that one, maybe. Yeah. So there's clear adaptations, one in adverse relationship to the other, together. If you're lactose intolerant, often your body fights off that bacteria. You kill it. Yeah, your body fights it off. So there's adaptive radiation. Really, we're all lactose intolerant. That's the secret. Just some of us have a healthier culture of bacteria that help us break down lactose into glucose and galactose. So it's a disaccharide. So over time, species may split into two or more lines of descendants or lineages. And as this splitting repeats, one species can give rise to many new species. And the process tends to speed up when a new species enters an environment that contains few other species. This often makes me think of the Anole lizard. This is a lizard that got displaced by a hurricane onto an island that had no lizards. And so the lizards spread, and they went everywhere. They reproduced, and then they all took in these little niches from all these little sub-climates on this island, and eventually they didn't breed with each other anymore, and they had all these different varieties. So they radiated to the different areas and became different and specialized that way. Rabbits did the same thing in Australia. And then looking at extinction, we all understand what that is. You guys have probably studied dinosaurs before, but we're in the middle of a mass extinction right now. We'll talk more about that in the next 2 chapters. But if all members of a lineage die off or simply fail to reproduce, the lineage is said to be extinct. And the fossil record shows that many lineages have arisen and radiated, but only a few of their descendants survived and evolved in the species present today. And, I mean, there was one time when this planet was covered in coral, another time it was covered in basically fungus. Another time where dinosaurs ruled the world, and there was the time when mammals ruled the world, and now we're in this intermediate stage where we're just average-sized people, but we're in the middle of another extinction right now, caused by who? Us. It's the first extinction that's ever been actually caused by a species, a single species. It's kind of weird, isn't it? Everything else. So macroevolution happens through a process called gradualism. And in Darwin's day, the idea of slow, gradual change was new to geology as well as biology. They did not think in the terms of millions of years. They were used to talking about them in terms of thousands, if that. And Darwin had argued that large-scale changes, such as the formation of new species, must require many small changes to build up gradually over a long period of time. And he called this model gradualism. Not just yet. We'll finish up and we'll get started first. Okay. So punctuated equilibrium. I talked about the Anole lizard. Did it change pretty quick? Yeah. That would be an example of punctuated equilibrium. Fast adaptive radiation. Now, some biologists argue that species do not always evolve gradually. Species may remain stable for long periods until environmental changes create new pressures. And then many new species may suddenly appear. Again, this is called punctuated equilibrium. Evolution can happen this way, but does it usually? No, it usually happens through gradualism, right? But sometimes we get drastic events that happen and displace large amounts of people and kill off a lot of other things. An example of punctuated equilibrium might even be the explosion of like mammals after the dinosaurs became extinct. We don't know because a lot of those fossil records of the mammals don't exist because they thrived after that. So discoveries since Darwin's time, especially in genetics, have been added to the theory to explain the evolutionary process and the evolution of different species. And because it affects every species of biology, scientists can study evolution at many different scales. Generally, they range from micro to macroevolution, with this thing called speciation, becoming a new species, happening in between.